take it away.
Thank you very much. Well, let's start with something very basic. As you can see, this is a rock. And if you walked along the street and saw it, you'd probably ignore it. A kid might pick it up and throw it. But have you ever considered what the difference between a rock and a stone is? A rock and a stone. You wear a gemstone. You don't wear a gem rock. You build a road with paving stones. You build a stone fence. You build a stone wall, but you climb a rock wall. In other words, the difference between a stone and a rock is the minute we take a rock as human beings and we make it useful or we change it, it becomes a stone. And what this lecture is about is a time in history when this rock you're looking at became a stone, and in the process helped bring the nation out of its lowest point since its founding 38 years before. And the way we begin this is with this man, Benjamin Latrobe, who's known as the father of American architecture, but he's much more than that. Benjamin Latrobe was born in England, and he was born in a Moravian family, which meant he had access to the best education possible in the 18th century. So by the time he got out of school, when he was about 20 years old, he spoke 5 languages. He was a competent musician and composer. He was a geologist. He was a botanist. He started working in England, working with canals, and because of his political sentiments, mostly he immigrated to America in 1795. And when he immigrated to America, within 2 weeks of being here, he was already conducting a course. He was tuning pianos. He was building a concert hall, and he soon moved up to Philadelphia. And on the way to Philadelphia, he stopped at George Washington's house. And George Washington, if you read his letters, is always complaining about the fact that after he was president, for the 2 years he lived after that, people always dropping into his house, and because of Virginia manners, that he would always give these people lunch and then send them on their way. In the case of Benjamin Latrobe, he kept him for 2 days discussing canals, something very dear to President Washington's heart, and we'll discuss that a little later. That is the Potomac Canal, which was George Washington's project. He then moves to Philadelphia. And when he moves to Philadelphia, he does many things. The most interesting thing I found was designing the first working water system in Philadelphia. This is 1802. He takes steam engines. He pumps water out of the river into these reservoirs, and takes another steam engine, pumps the water into these 57,000 gallon tanks. Now remember, everything's wood here. And from those tanks, the water was then moved onto through wooden pipes to every main street in Philadelphia. There was a spigot. And the way he did it is the day he turned on the water system, he made sure all the spigots were open. So all of a sudden, at noon on a Sunday, I think it was 1803, but I'm not sure, everybody in Philadelphia looked out of their house and there was water squirting out of the spigot. So he also had a sense of humor, obviously. So he attracted the attention of the American Philosophical Society. Now, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin before the Revolution, and Franklin's purpose was to bring together the great minds of the newly developing America to help develop science, to help develop ideas in this country, to help this country grow. And they attracted some of the most brilliant minds, and he was recruited. Now, people often ask me, why did Franklin call it the American Philosophical Society, not the American Scientific Society? And that's because before there was all these breakdowns in science, geology, biology, and botany, before that, all of these men and women, by the way, because there were women in the American Philosophical Society, men and women consider themselves natural philosophers. Their job was to understand the creation, God's creation. And that meant they weren't simply botanists, but they were everything. Like Franklin worked on electricity. He also worked on currents when he was traveling on a boat. Well, that's what these people did. So he was recruited to the American Philosophical Society, and there he met Thomas Jefferson, who was also a member of the American Philosophical Society. And when Jefferson became president, he said, I need you to come to Washington, and I'll make you the architect of the Capitol, because the federal buildings that were supposed to be done by now are just a mess, and I need someone to finish them. And that started a that started a partnership between Jefferson and Latrobe, which continued for many, many years. Now, it was a very difficult partnership. And one of the reasons was because they were different generations. Jefferson was a lot older. But the main problem was that Latrobe considered himself, this is his quote, a bigoted Greek. That means that he felt that he believed that the Greek classical architecture and art were necessary in this new country as public art in order to ennoble the country, in order to educate the country, so that we would be able to develop Republican institutions. Don't forget, the Republic is written by Plato. This is a Greek classical work, just like the Parthenon is Greek classical work. So he considered himself a bigoted Greek. On the other hand, Jefferson, well, the problem he had with Jefferson, I'll read you what he says. He says, I'm cramped in this design, that is the design of the Capitol, by Thomas Jefferson's prejudices in favor of the old French books out of which he fishes everything. So they had a kind of a stormy relationship, but nevertheless, by about 1812, they had accomplished quite a bit. What you're looking at here is a painting of the Capitol in 1812. On the left is the Senate, the Library of Congress, and the Supreme Court. On the right is the House of Representatives, and in between is a wooden walkway, which would eventually become the dome. Now, the interesting thing is we don't really know what it looked like inside. Nobody ever painted it. Photography wasn't invented for another 35, 40 years. Nobody painted it. There's some written descriptions. So we really don't know. But fortunately, an artist by the name of Richard Chenworth took all the notes and scribblings about what it looked like inside, and he developed this computer model. All right. And this is what the Capitol looked like through the House of Representatives looked like through 1812. And let's take a look at this because it'll inform us about the future of the Capitol, which is one of the things we're going to be talking about. Let me point out some things here. First of all, you notice it has fluted columns. The columns are made of Acai Creek sandstone, which I'll talk more about. All right. They're ionic. They're Corinthian. They're Corinthian. You see the acacia leaves, and you'll notice that on the dome there are all these panes of glass. There are 100 panes of glass. Now, this is Jefferson's idea. He saw this not in an old French book, but he saw this in an old French grain market when he was in France, and he had to have it. Now, Latrobe was against it for a lot of reasons. Number one, they didn't have modern caulking materials, so Latrobe knew it would leak with the caulking materials they had. He was afraid it would create very funny atmospheric conditions. The other thing is the diffusion of light, he felt, would be very distracting for the people sitting down here trying to do their work. But nevertheless, they went ahead with it. There was no one in the United States at this time who could make glass like this. So they had to send to England and then to Germany to get the glass. The other thing that you see here, see these curtains? The reason they had these curtains was for acoustical reasons. Latrobe was one of the first architects to study acoustics. The congressmen were complaining there were a lot of echoes. So what Latrobe figured out is if he hung these long curtains, it would kill the echoes, and it did, and that worked. The other thing, which is not pictured here, was there was an eagle, an American eagle, with a 14-foot wingspread. And the idea was always to remind the congressmen of the fact that they were working for the United States, for America, for the Republic. So unfortunately, just like we couldn't make glass, there was nobody in the United States who could carve marble. There were no stone carvers who could do it. There was a guy in New York who could do wood carving, but there was nobody who could do stone. So what happened is Congress allocates the money to import 2 Italian marble sculptors and their families. Their names are Giuseppe Franzoni and Giovanni Andre. They arrived in February 1806. And Latrobe says to Franzoni, carve me an eagle. And Franzoni starts going to work at it. And after a few weeks, it's clear to Latrobe that it's not an American bald eagle, it's a European eagle. How would Franzoni know what a bald eagle looks like? So this is a terrible thing. You can't have this European eagle. So what Latrobe does is he sends to his friend, Charles Wilson Peale, Now, the reason I show this picture is I just think it's a wonderful self-portrait of Charles Willson Peale, who's a famous artist. He painted all the founding fathers. He had like 11 children, and he named them after all the great artists of the Renaissance. Let's see, he named children Rembrandt, Raphael, Titian, Rubens. But the most important thing here is that he had a museum. And this is a self-portrait of him opening up the curtain to his museum. And in this museum, he had specimens of every animal in North America, including the skeleton of a mastodon, which is right here, okay, and here. And notice you have samples here of specimens. You have art above here. And notice there are men, women, and children, because the purpose of this museum was universal knowledge. And as you probably could guess, Peale was in the American Philosophical Society, okay? So he sends to Peale, he says, have one of your talented children draw me a bald eagle. And the next week, a carriage arrives in town with a stuffed bald eagle. And Franzoni went to work, and there was a bald eagle carved here. So this was a glorious building. It was considered one of the most beautiful legislative chambers in the Western world. And if you look at it, you can see it is really quite beautiful, quite beautiful. And then it all came to an end. Why did it come to an end? Well, you may remember that the War of 1812 started in 1812. This is 1814. The war had been going on for 2 years. In our area, the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River, the British had ships. And what they were doing was they were making raids, nocturnal raids, mostly with raids during the day too, on the tobacco plantations. The British were very chary about putting mass troops on the American continent. They had learned their lesson in the Revolution. Remember, we had Saratoga, where they were slaughtered. We had Bunker Hill, even though we lost it, they were slaughtered. And we had Yorktown. The British were terrified of putting troops on the American continent. In addition to which, the British were at war. This was, while this was going on, the British were fighting Napoleon in Europe. And the logistics of fighting in America were ridiculous. For example, during the Revolution, when the British had troops on the American continent, it took 3 horses. You needed 2 horses to pull enough fodder on a wagon for 3 horses, which meant if you had 3 horses on the continent, only one could be used for fighting. The British had to bring firewood in from Europe because they couldn't access the firewood on the American continent, because every time they made forays, they were shot at. So it was a logistical nightmare. So all the British did under Rear Admiral Cockburn and General Ross was they attacked the tobacco plantations all along Chesapeake Bay. One thing they did, which was very interesting, was they freed 3,600 slaves. Now, they had freed slaves during the Revolution, but most of those slaves ended up in a very dire condition. In this situation, they learned their lesson, and they actually freed 3,600 slaves. Most of them ended up going up to Canada or serving in the Royal Navy. And they created a group of 400 militia of former slave men who, of course, the plantation owners were terrified of. So as you can imagine, the Chesapeake Bay area was completely terrified. What happened in April of 1814 that changed the situation? Well, Napoleon's defeated. With Napoleon being defeated, the British suddenly had all these fighters who were in Europe who were free to finally end this war against these upstart Jonathans, as they called us. And they decided to send an expedition of 4,500 British soldiers, and they brought that expedition into Chesapeake Bay, up the Patuxent River, to Benedict, all right? And this was on August 19th. The temperature was about 98 degrees. The humidity was, as you can imagine, because we've all lived in our summers here. And the British troops landed. They were wearing fine wool jackets, linen shirts, and hemp trousers. And as they marched up this route here towards Upper Marlborough, they were so full of themselves, these guys, because they had defeated Napoleon, that they sang a song, which was the latest hit in London at the time. And that song was from the Judas Maccabeus the Judas Maccabeus oratorio by Handel. And the song they sang, I want you to get an image of this, was "See the conquering heroes come, sound the trumpets, beat the drums, sports prepare, the laurels bring, songs of triumphs to him sing." So these were not soldiers, these were soldiers. And they really, really thought they were fighting the revolution again, and this time they were going to win. Now, what's going on in Washington? In Washington, there's panic. The President Madison says, I have to send a spy over to this outside of Benedict to find out where the British are going. The reason is because even though everyone knew they were coming to Washington, the only person who disagreed was the Washburn, who was the head of the Department of War. The head of Madison's Department of War said, no, they're not going to Washington, they're going to Baltimore. So Madison has to send a spy. Who does he send as a spy? This is a different world. There's no CIA. Why? He sends his Secretary of State, Monroe. And Monroe jumps on a horse with 12 militiamen, and he rides from Washington. He rides to the hills around Benedict, and he spies on the British. And then he rides back and tells the president, yup, they're coming to Washington, D.C. Now, just as a side issue, Monroe was no wuss. The future President Monroe had crossed the Delaware with Washington and was wounded in Trenton. So he was a person who had been a warrior. So what happens is Madison and Monroe decide they're going to make a last stand at Bladensburg. Before they do that, various very brave clerks get some important papers out of Washington, D.C., including George Washington's retirement speech, some copies of the Declaration of Independence. And this is despite the Secretary of War saying, don't bother, they're not coming here. Okay. And the British march up to Bladensburg. There's a holding action there by American militia who outnumber the British troops. Remember what I told you about the British troops. These weren't troops. These were troops. And who's in this battle is the President of the United States and all of his cabinet. That is, the whole cabinet and the president turned out in this battle. And as soon as they saw that the British were going to sweep away the militia, they retired up to Washington. They retired up to Virginia. And the British entered Washington. And when they entered Washington, it was pretty empty. There were a few people who greeted them. This is ironic. The granddaughter of Martha Washington was such a Anglophile that she named her house Tudor Place and named her daughter Britannia. She was out there waving in the British, but pretty much everyone else left. So the British come into Washington and started burning. Now, of course, there's a lot more to this story, but we're going to go through this quickly to give you the historical context. Okay. They started burning. What's pictured here is the House of Representatives, and what's pictured here is the Senate, and there's that walkway in between. So the question then is raised by many people: how do you burn a stone building? Interesting question, isn't it? Well, like with most of things in history, in order to understand that, you have to go back a few years, and you have to go back to the British colonization of India. You know, the British didn't just walk into India without any resistance. There was tremendous resistance by the various kingdoms in India. Among them was the kingdom of Mysore in southern India. The British fought a lot of wars against the kingdom of Mysore, and they were very surprised to find out that when they fought wars against the kingdom of Mysore, they were attacked by rockets. And they weren't very accurate, but they were scary as hell. And that intrigued the British, so they captured some of these rockets. They sent them back to London, and they gave them to a scientist by the name of William Congreve. And William Congreve developed the rocket into something more fearsome and more accurate. In fact, the rocket was used a tremendous amount in the wars against Napoleon. And when the British came came and invaded up the river in the picture I showed you earlier at Benedict, they had rocket ships, which are not our rocket ships. A rocket ship for the British was a ship from whence you launched rockets. So what the British did to burn this building when they failed a few times is the first thing they did is they took these Congreve rockets, The ones they had weighed 40 pounds and they were filled with black powder. They did have some that weighed up to 300 pounds, and they were used in the fight against Fort McHenry in Baltimore. So they took these rockets, which had 40 pounds of black powder in them, and what they did is they fired them at the glass ceiling. Remember I told you about that glass ceiling, which is each glass panel was a foot thick, and it didn't really do any damage. So the next thing they did is they took all of the furniture in the House of Representatives. Remember those hangings, those wall hangings for acoustical reasons? They took the wall hangings. They made a big pile and they took their concrete rockets and they broke them open and they poured the black powder on top. And then they lit it on fire. And the fire was so hot that the sandstone, remember I pointed out the fluted sandstone columns? The sandstone started to calcinate, which is what happens in a kiln when you have a limestone kiln. The limestone breaks down, and that's what started happening to the walls of the House of Representatives. Now, on the other side, in the Senate, it was a lot easier because they had the Library of Congress there. They had 3,000 books. So they took the 3,000 books in the Library of Congress and other things, which you would imagine, and they lit them on fire, and they did a lot of damage to the Senate. Now, one of the ironies, of course, is almost all of those books that they burned were British. That's irony of this thing. And another irony is that the leader of this burning was Irish. Most of his, probably a good majority of his soldiers were Irish in the British Army. And the people who eventually repaired the Capitol were Irish workmen, because a large part of the population in Washington, well, the working population, were Irish, and most of them didn't speak English. They still spoke Gaelic. So it's an interesting irony of history that this is Irish against the Irish. But anyway, let's keep going. So the fire was so huge, not just from the Capitol, but from the White House burning. We burned the Navy Yard to keep it out of the hands of the British. The fire was so huge that the glow was seen where I live in Leesburg, Virginia, which is 40 miles away. All right. That's how huge it was. There's a good picture. Now, there were some regrets on the part of some of the officers. I have a quote here from a lieutenant to Cockburn, who said, "It's a pity to burn anything so beautiful." Ross later said that he was upset about burning the books because, you know, he didn't believe in burning books, but nevertheless, they did it. And then after burning the city, not the city, burning the government buildings, they left. And there's a nice little doggerel poem by Philip Freneau. He writes, "A veteran host, by veterans led, with Ross and Cockburn at their head, they came, they saw, they burned, and fled." Now, where did they fled to? Where did they flee to? Wrong tense. They fled to Baltimore, where they cooperated with the British Navy in attacking Fort McHenry and attempting to reduce Baltimore. And they failed. One of the people who was there to watch this battle, of course, was Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Declaration of Independence. Obviously, he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, what I like to say is, despite the Congreve rocket's red glare and the bombs bursting in air, they were unable to penetrate Baltimore. And of course, that's what those rockets were. They were huge Congreve rockets fired out of ships. They weighed over 300 pounds, but they didn't reduce Fort McHenry. And the war is soon over. By February 18th, 1815, which is 6 months later, the Treaty of Ghent is signed and the war is over. And then I don't know how many weeks later, there was the unfortunate Battle of New Orleans, unfortunate for the British because they were defeated. Of course, it was an unnecessary battle because the war had already been over. Okay. Now Congress has to debate. Do we rebuild the Capitol in Washington, or do we move? Now, there were a lot of interests that wanted to move. The New York interests wanted to move to New York, and the Philadelphia interests wanted to move back to Philadelphia. And there was a lot of debate about this. And in fact, there was one proposal, which you'll enjoy, is that the Capitol should be built on the intersection of the Potomac and the Monocacy River. Wouldn't that be interesting? But all of these things were defeated. All of these attempts to not build in Washington were defeated. And they were defeated by a man who had been dead since 1799. Because it was George Washington's imprimatur that defeated the attempt to move Washington. Because in all these congressional speeches, and they're worth reading, not only because people spoke beautifully in those days, but because they're interesting, people said over and over again, George Washington, the great man, was here. He said, put this building here, put the Capitol here. And as one congressman said, what that man has done, let no mortal attempt to undo. So Congress, and also the banks in DC offered a $500,000 loan for rebuild at 6%. So that meant that the money was there. So on February 9th in 1815, Congress votes to say in DC, 77 to 55, 12 votes in another direction, and you'd be able to almost walk to the Capitol because it would be in the Montgomery River in the, I don't think so, but it was 12 votes. And then on February 13th, Congress passes an appropriation to begin building. And then the question is, who's going to rebuild the Capitol? Where is Latrobe at this point, you ask? Well, I'll tell you where Latrobe is. Latrobe is in Pittsburgh. As soon as the money stopped coming for the Capitol in 1812 in preparation for war, Latrobe, there's no money, Latrobe leaves Washington, and he makes a deal with Robert Fulton. Fulton wants to build steamboats in Pittsburgh to go from the Ohio down the Mississippi and back. Okay, now this is Latrobe, right? The one who built the Capitol and the waterworks. I want to emphasize that because obviously you can see I'm completely nonplussed by this guy. So he goes to Pittsburgh and he builds steamboats, and it's a complete failure. It's a complete failure. He goes bankrupt. At one point, he writes his friends, we're eating our furniture, which means he's selling his furniture to eat. The money is pulled out by Robert Fulton. He's in a terrible situation, and Latrobe goes into what we would call today a depression. Sits in a room in the dark, doesn't want to be bothered, doesn't want to do anything. And his wife, Mary Latrobe, who is a very interesting woman who I don't have time to talk about, but I will tell you, besides being extremely educated and strong woman, she is what we would call today a classical guitarist. But of course, in those days, they wouldn't call it classical because Beethoven was still living and Mozart had only died about 20 years before. But she was a wonderful guitarist, and she was known in Washington and in Pittsburgh for that. She decides that she's going to do something about this. She's not going to let her husband sink into despair. And she writes a letter to her good friend, the president's wife, Dolly Madison. Now, why are Mary Latrobe and Dolly Madison good friends? Well, because when the Latrobes lived in Washington and Dolly Madison wanted to decorate the White House, she called on the people in Washington with the best taste. And that was Benjamin and Mary Latrobe. And the three of them essentially went shopping for furniture at the White House, and they maintained their relationship. She says, look, have your husband hire my husband. He built the first iteration of the Capitol. He made it successful. Let him build the second iteration. And she wrote to all kinds of influential people. And finally, Madison was convinced, and I understand that Dolly Madison was very convincing, and said, okay, come on out and rebuild the Capitol. And he comes in 1815, he's appointed. All right, now he's appointed in 1815. And he comes from Pittsburgh by way of Leesburg, Virginia, and comes to the Capitol, and he sees what you're looking at here. It's a magnificent ruin, as Benjamin Latrobe puts it. And there's graffiti on the walls because people will be people. Some of the graffiti said Madison is a coward for obviously letting the British not defending the Capitol. There's other graffiti about Cockburn, the British general, which I won't repeat, you can imagine. There's globs of melted glass on the floor from the rockets. The glass had melted, the columns had calcinated. It was a complete mess. What Latrobe says is the only fact, and I'm quoting here, that I regret deeply is the destruction of our national records. Everything else, money can replace, because the national records were the record of history, were the record of a republic, the first republic modeled on Plato's republic from Latrobe's standpoint. And these were important records for history forever. And that's what he really regretted. He also writes to his sister, I'm going to restore these buildings infinitely more splendidly than they existed before the invasion of the Goths. And that, by the way, is how the British were talked about all over the world after this. Okay. Rebuilding the capital. Now, there's an agreement by the new President Monroe, who comes in at this point, and Congress, that the new capital has to be more magnificent than the old. Now, there are a lot of reasons. If your enemy destroys your capital and you move or you don't rebuild it more magnificently, he has still won. He has still won, right? He's reduced you. And there was a determination on the part of not just the president, but of the nation as a whole, that they would prove they would not be reduced by the British. Plus, they wanted to use American building materials, which was difficult. There were very few roads. There was not much transportation. And the other, as I've repeated over and over, and we'll keep repeating, these guys were all classically educated. And the Parthenon in Athens, which they considered one of the great, and we still do consider one of the great buildings of humanity, was built of marble. So the question was, could we build this of marble? That was an interesting question. And Latrobe knew about Potomac Marble along the Potomac and in Loudoun County. And he waged a successful fight to incorporate it in the capital. Now, you find it interesting that after, let's see, when we started, 7? After 35 minutes, I finally mentioned Potomac Marble. Well, you got to have the history before it makes any sense, okay? So what do I mean he waged a political fight? Latrobe wanted to use this marble, and you'll see samples of it because it's glorious, all right? His only alternative was the sandstone that was used in the previous iteration, which at this point is pretty well in bad. I'll talk about the quarries in a second, okay? So listen to how this worked. Monroe is inaugurated on March 4th, 1817. On the same day he's inaugurated, master stonecutter George Blagden goes to Monroe and says, you can't use Potomac marble. It can't be cut. It can't be polished. It won't bear its own weight. Now, I ask you to consider the president of the United States is newly inaugurated and he allows a meeting with a stonecutter to talk about Potomac marble. It gives you some sense of how important these questions were about rebuilding the capital. So, and I'll tell you a little side story, which you'll find amusing. So this stonecutter in, whether it is 1815 says, you can't use Potomac marble, it can't be cut, it can't be polished, it's all gonna fall apart. Now, when I wanted to polish some examples of Potomac marble, which I had, I didn't have the equipment. Now I have the equipment. I went around to some stonecutters, you know, guys who make granite countertops. And I found a guy in Sterling, a really very nice guy. And I said to him, Aaron's Marble and Granite, wonderful company. And I walked in with these 2 rocks and I said, look, could you cut this in half of me and polish? And the stonecutter, 204 years later, looks at me and says, that can't be cut. That can't be polished. It's all going to fall apart. So Potomac marble is the nemesis of all stonecutters. And of course, he did cut it, and it was possible to polish it. Okay, that's the first thing that happens. So Latrobe then has to make a sample column and show all in Congress that it actually can be cut and polished. The next thing that happens is that Latrobe, yes, what next thing that happens is Monroe is afraid that the columns, if they're made of Potomac marble, won't hold up the ceiling. So he goes to General Swift. He appoints General Swift to go out to the quarries, both in Loudoun County and in Montgomery County, and determine whether it can be done. Now, who's General Swift? General Swift is the first soldier to graduate from West Point. General Swift later became the commandant of West Point. General Swift is the engineer of the Army. Okay, so a few days after he's inaugurated, the president sends the engineer of the Army out to the quarries to determine whether or not this stone will work. Again, this is how important building would be, rebuilding the capital. And General Swift comes back and he says, it's good. So Monroe, who obviously is a very careful guy, gets in a coach with General Swift and he drives through Loudoun County looking at quarries, goes across Nolan's Ferry, which is up by Point of Rocks, comes down from Point of Rocks, down through towards what is now White's Ferry, looking at the quote, the quarries in order to make his final decision. And he says, yes, we're going to use it. We're going to use Potomac Marble. And therefore the battle was won. Okay. So I hope I gave you an idea of how different the world was. If you could imagine the current president of the United States getting that involved, but this was a question of the future of the nation and of rebuilding the nation's spirit. Okay, let's move on. So now we're going to talk a little bit about quarrying because it's really cool. So this is the actual quarry where the sandstone from the first iteration of the capital came from. This is Acai Creek sandstone, otherwise known as Virginia freestone. And this is the quarry. You can go there if you want. And it's like they put their tools down yesterday. By the way, when you see this meter stick here, I put this meter stick here. So where I show pictures like this, you'll get a sense of scale. All right. So that's a meter. Okay. Where was Acai Creek Quarry? Well, here is Washington, D.C. Nowadays, to get down there, you take Route 95. See this? You go right down here outside of Stafford, and you can go to that quarry. But of course, there was no Route 95 in those days, but there was the Potomac River. Now, the Potomac River is great because you can take the largest ships of the time up the Potomac River all the way up to Georgetown, which was a major port. And I'll talk about that later. And that's where the fall line is. That's where Little Falls is and eventually Great Falls. So this was the route you could use to bring stone up to Washington. And that's why there was two reasons why this quarry was used for the first iteration of the capital. One is because it had good sandstone. And second, because it was on a river. So I want to talk about for a minute how they actually quarried this stone back in the early 19th century. And I'll tell you what they did. First thing they would do is using chisels. Well, they would, after clearing off the top, they would chisel out a 20-inch wide gap. You see this here? Actually a walkway for a man. And then they chisel out a 20-inch gap behind it. And then they do a check around on the side of it. So at that point, you have this block of granite, which is freed from on every side except the bottom. All right. And the next thing they would do is they would chisel these cuts here. See this? Then they would put spreaders in here, and I'll show you what they look like. And they would hammer them in until it broke off, because this was freestone. It broke off very easily. And they would have these stones, and they put them on not a cart, because they couldn't use wheels, because the wheels with this kind of stone in it would sink in the mud. They would drag it out to the river and bring it up to Washington, D.C. So that was the basic way they did it. Now, I want to show you some of the tools that they used, because this is kind of fun. You can see we have chisels, we have wedges, and then some tools that you've probably never heard of. And at this point, I'm going to turn off my screen sharing, and I'm going to show you the actual tools. So let me turn off my pointer. Hold on a second. Pointer. Give me a sec. Oh, I see what I have to do. Okay. Pointer options. Well, let's not do it that way. I'm going to end sharing. Hold on. Whoops. There we go. All right, I'll get it, guys. Don't worry. Okay. So now, everyone knows what a chisel looks like, right? That's nothing new and nothing unusual. But this is an interesting tool. You might want to maximize me at this point so you can see these tools. You might find that useful, okay? This is called a star drill. Can you see the star on the end of it? All right. Now, the way a star drill works is you would have two people. You'd have the guy with the hammer, and you'd have a guy who's called a shaker. All right. And the shaker would hold it to the ground like this, and the guy with the 8-pound sledgehammer would hit it. Boom! And then the shaker would turn it a third. And the guy with the 8-pound hammer would hit it. Boom! And he'd turn it a third. And they would continue in this way. And then when dust built up in the hole, the shaker would move the dust out. And then as it got deeper and deeper, instead of blowing the dust out, the shaker would put some water in, mix the drill around, and pull the mud out. And as it got really, really deep, they would use a tool you never heard of. It's called a deep hole mud spoon. And a deep hole mud spoon was literally a little tiny spoon with a long stem that they would stick in the hole to pull out the dust, okay? And that's how it worked. A guy who used one of these drills was paid a penny an inch, and they were expected to do 60 inches a day, all right? 60 inches a day. Now, I'll tell you something about this tool. This tool is a piece of American folklore, but you probably never realized it, and I'll prove it to you. You ready? John Henry said to his captain, "A man ain't nothing but a man. But unless I drill, John Henry said to, now I forgot the words. John Henry said to his captain, a man ain't nothing but a man. But before I let your steam drill beat me down, I'll die with a hammer in my hand. Lord, Lord, I'll die with a hammer in my hand." What's he doing? He's hammering in a star drill. And he's upset about the steam drills, which do a better job. He's hammering in a star drill. Look at the second verse of that song. John Henry said to his shaker, "Shaker boy, you better pray. Because if my 12-pound hammer misses that little piece of steel, tomorrow be your burying day, Lord, Lord. Tomorrow be your burying day." So this is a piece of American folk culture. And most people don't even know it. Wait, let's not leave out the Irish. Every morning at 7 o'clock, there are 14 tarriers working at the rock. And the boss comes along and he says, "Keep still and come down heavy on the cast iron drill. And drill ye tarriers, drill and blast and fire." Now, they weren't just drilling holes. The reason they were drilling holes was, and I'll talk about another tool so they could split the rock off, but they also drilled holes in order to fill them with black powder, to create explosions, to blow off a piece of the face of the rock. Now, obviously, if you're trying to build something with construction blocks, you don't use black powder. But if you just try to dig a tunnel, like the Pawpaw Tunnel, which is what I think John Henry was doing, then you use the star drill to make a hole. You fill it up with black powder, you put wax over it, and you stick a fuse in, you light it and run. Now, some interesting caveats. They're using black powder. They're not using dynamite. Dynamite was invented by Alfred Nobel in the 1880s, 1890s. Dynamite is a lot more stable than black powder. And black powder is subsonic and dynamite is supersonic. So it's a lot more powerful, but a lot more stable. By the way, have you ever considered why it's called dynamite? Because the Greek word for power is dynamis. I guess everybody knew Greek in the 19th century. Anyway, let's keep going. So they didn't have safety fuses either. Safety fuses were invented in the 1830s. And the idea of a safety fuse is it's a rope filled with black powder. And when you light the rope, it'll burn it burns at a steady rate. In fact, I have the rate, 30 seconds per foot. So that means if you want to give yourself 5 minutes to get away, okay, then you do 5 feet. Is that right? Well, something like that. It's the arithmetic. You do 5 feet of safety fuse and you got time to get away. They didn't have safety fuses. What they would do is they would take a piece of greased paper, they stick it in the wax, they'd light the greased paper and get the heck out of there. So there were a lot of grievous accidents with powder. But nevertheless, that's how tunnels were built, and that's how canals were built as well. So I don't know how I got on that, but I think that's really fascinating. So let's go back to the next tool. The next tool, which I'll show you, is called a splitter or wedge and feathers. All right, let me show you this. These are the feathers. All right. Where am I? These are the feathers, they're called. And here's the wedge and feathers. All right. Can you see that? And here's how it works. Let's say your guy with a hammer and your shaker drilled a hole in this rock here. Okay. And they drilled a whole series of holes, and you want to break off this whole piece of stone, let's say for a column. Okay. You drill all these holes, and then you take your feathers. You put one feather in each hole. So you'd have them all along the face of the rock. And then you take the wedge and you start hammering it in. Boom, 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 right? And each one of these begins to spread. And over time, and not much time, the rock will break off. So that's called a wedge and feathers, another tool that they use. This is still used today. Okay, that's fun. All right, the last tool, I have to go back on my PowerPoint presentation. So I'm gonna go back and share the screen if I can figure out how to do it. Give me a second. Let's see, sharing the screen. There we go. And whoops. Share screen. And share. Okay, let's continue from the current slide. Okay, that's right, it's working, right? Okay. You notice this tool over here called a Lewis pin? I bet you no one's ever heard of this because I hadn't heard of it. Here's the trick with a Lewis pin. Remember, they're not even using steam on these sites, okay? Everything is hand labor. So you have to figure out clever tools in order to get things done. Now, let's say you want to lift a rock, or in this case, obviously it's a stone that's really, really heavy. What you do in each of your stones, let me get myself a pointer here. Pointer options, laser. You see this piece of, this is a piece of sandstone. You notice that there's a hole drilled in the middle with a star drill? There's a purpose for that. That's so the stone can be lifted with a Lewis pin. Now look at this tool over here. You notice that there's two blades, 1, 2, and each blade has teeth on it, all right? Now what happens if I put these blades together, stick it in this hole, and then tie a rope to this Lewis pin, put it on a pulley, and have a man pull the rope. As the chain goes up, this blade goes this way and digs into the side of the hole. This blade goes this way and digs into the side of the hole, and you can just lift the rock right up, and that's called a Lewis pin. And they're still used today. I tried to buy one so I could show you, but they're really, really expensive. So those are the tools that were used in those days. And I think we'll move on. I hope you found that interesting. Okay, Acai Creek Sandstone. There's what it looks like. The first iteration of the Capitol was built with this. This is Doric columns. Doric are the simple columns in the Capitol crypt. You could go on any tour of the Capitol is going to take you in the crypt. The crypt is where Washington was supposed to be buried, but they didn't consult Washington. And when they did, he said, no way. And his family said, no way. But nevertheless, the crypt is there. You can go. These are Acai Creek Sandstone columns, Doric columns. By the way, below the crypt, they'll never take you there. But if you ask your congressperson to give you a special tour, which you can do, which I did, and you've got a good guy who's willing to take you on places most people don't go, below the crypt is Lincoln's catafalque. And the catafalque is the table used for Lincoln's coffin when it was on display after his assassination. And that's what's below right here. Okay, so these are the Acai Creek Sandstone columns. Look at that column. Notice how rough it is. Notice the discoloring, okay? Very strong, it's in the crypt, it's holding up the whole building. But remember what that looks like, all right? So Acai Creek Sandstone, available in great abundance. It's only 45 miles from Washington. It's easily carved. It's true by 1817, the quality had declined, but for Latrobe, what was most important? It's not beautiful. Look, how beautiful is that? Not beautiful, okay? Latrobe wrote, it was not of a texture fit for the finer works of buildings. Potomac Marble. So now we're on Potomac Marble 100%, all right? What is Potomac Marble? Well, about 250 million years ago, there were great rivers flowing over where you're sitting and over where I'm sitting, as a matter of fact, as well, towards me from you. And that left, because I'm in Leesburg, Virginia, that left these fan-shaped alluvial deposits. And they were small pebbles, all kinds of stones. And over time, these became well, actually, let's just go back and talk about geology for a second. There's three kinds of stone. There's igneous, comes from the bowels of the earth. Imagine lava coming up in a volcano. There's sedimentary, which is the result of usually water, but also wind depositing layers upon layers of stones and sand, which eventually, through its own pressure and through chemical processes, becomes hardened as stone, like sandstone, which is a silicon hardening, and limestone, which is a calcium carbonate hardening. And then there's metamorphic rock, which is when sedimentary rocks are forced down into the earth, subjected to great heat and pressure, and they're changed. A good example of a metamorphic rock is marble, okay? If you took Potomac Marble, which is a sedimentary rock deposited by these rivers, and you subject it to tremendous heat and pressure, you're going to get marble, real marble, which is a metamorphic rock. In fact, here's an interesting fact. Not 8 miles from my house here in Leesburg, Virginia, we have some of the best marble in the country. It's never been really used for much, but it's there. I've seen it. Where did it come from? Well, we have most of what's under me and is Potomac Marble going down at least 3,000 feet. But there was a period when there was a great intrusion of igneous rock. And that's why we have a quarry about 3 miles from here, which quarries igneous pebbles for roads. That igneous rock metamorphosized our Potomac Marble and created Loudon Marble. So that's how it works. So it's not actually marble, Potomac Marble. It's actually a conglomerate, otherwise known as a breccia, of limestone, quartz, feldspar, all kinds of pebbles held together in what's called a calcium carbonate matrix. All right, it's not been subjected to the heat and pressure which creates marble, but when it's polished, it's quite beautiful. So here, that's marble. Not bad, right? This is from Loudoun County, as a matter of fact. I polished it myself. This is from Italy. This is Carrara marble from Italy. You know, this is what statues are carved from in Italy and here as well. So very nice, okay? Whoops, that's Potomac Marble. What a difference, right? This is glorious. And I polished those. Those are simply, you can see by the size of the penny. And what you have here is you have the matrix. Here's the matrix, which is a calcium carbonate matrix. And then you have the pebbles in it, which are called clasts, C-L-A-S-T-S. And these clasts could be different colors. Here's gray and white. Here's black. Here's red. And they're all different sizes and jumbled together, all right? And they all different shapes, which is why it's called a breccia. If these were all rounded small pebbles like at the beach, this would be called pudding stone, but it's not, it's a breccia. So this is the gorgeous stuff that Latrobe wanted to use, as opposed to using the Acai Creek sandstone again. And this is what he created. This is a wonderful painting, and boy, the actual painting in the National Gallery is a lot more beautiful than this, trust me. This is the House of Representatives in 1822, painted by Samuel F.B. Morse. Yes, the inventor of the telegraph was a wonderful artist who, when he didn't make money on art, invented the telegraph, thank God. And this is what he created. Here are the Potomac Marble columns. You see this? Got them? See? Here, look. All right, now look here. These are the Potomac Marble columns. Here's the drapery for acoustics. The ceiling up here is all done with plaster. They're wonderful, skilled plasterers. And this is what he created. Now, on a side note, people ask me what this is. Well, obviously, this is the light. This is a night meeting, and this is a light. The light they used in 1822 is whale oil. They switched pretty soon. I'm trying to get the dates here. They replaced whale oil in 1830 with kerosene. And then by 1840s, they began to use natural gas. But this is whale oil. That's how they lit. Oh, and by the way, just as a side note, another side note, they heated it with steam heat. And they had bathrooms in it. Okay? Okay, let's keep going. So that's the House of Representatives. You got to admit, it's pretty glorious, right? Okay, so here, this is the old House chamber. Now it's known as the statuary. If you had a tour of the Capitol, you were here. And you probably looked at the statues. And you didn't look at the columns. And by now we know, what do we know about statues? They're ephemeral. The columns will last forever. Who knows what statues are going to be there? So these are the Potomac Marble columns. They're gorgeous, with marble from Italy, with marble capitals, okay? Now, these are Corinthian columns. And the reason they're Corinthian columns is because you have here the acanthus leaves. You see the acanthus leaves? That's classical Corinthian columns, just like the Greeks did. Acanthus leaves symbolize for Greeks immortality and rebirth, which of course is just the kind of thing you want to have in a Republican institution, all right? Remember, if you go here on a tour, the statues are interesting. Look at the columns. All right, that's my admonition. Let's keep going. Whoops. Okay. Latrobe, though, and I may not have mentioned this, even though he was a bigoted Greek, he didn't want to build Greek temples to the gods. He was building temples to Republican government. So what he did in some of his Corinthian columns is instead of using Greek acanthus leaves, he used corn cobs. And those are the famous Corinthian corncob columns, also known as the Corinthian columns. That's a joke. I didn't make it up, but that's a joke. And he also used tobacco leaves, which of course was one of the main export crops of the country at that point. So these are also Corinthian columns, but they're not using the Greek acanthus leaves. All right. Now here's in the Senate, the old Senate, which you can go to. And these are the Potomac Marble columns in the old Senate. And you notice they're ionic. You see the scrolls? That makes them ionic columns, all right? Well, Latrobe said about this, and I have it over here because I think it's a wonderful quote. He says, as the cement which unites the pebbles does not receive quite so high a polish as the pebbles themselves, the mass acquires a spangled appearance, which adds greatly to the effect of its brilliancy. Now, I've been asked, why do they all look gray and my samples are so colorful? And that's my photography. This is a very dark room. I did the best I could. But anyway, you'll go see them yourselves and take a tour of the Capitol and you'll see them. Oops. Oh, there we go. Let's just say some of the characteristics quickly of Potomac Marble. It covers 18 square miles of Loudoun County, then stretches over to the Maryland, your side of the Potomac River, okay? It has many names. I call it Potomac Marble. Other people call it Calico Marble, Conglomerate. There's a million different names for it. And I've said this already. It consists of pebbles called clasts in a calcium carbonate matrix, which are 90% limestone, 10% quartz, and feldspar. The size of the pebbles are microscopic to 9 feet. Apparently, there's a 9-foot pebble somewhere near my house. I haven't found it. The deposit is no more than 1.5 miles wide, and it's up to 3,150 feet deep. And for those geologists out there, it's 4 on the Mohs scale. Diamond is 10, talc is 1. Okay. The most important thing about Potomac Marble is it's ubiquitous. Here, for example, is a marble outcrop in Idle Park in Leesburg, which is very near to me. Here's a close-up of it, okay? Here's a Potomac Marble outcrop near Point of Rocks. This is near you guys in Camp Conowa. Here's the railroad. The towpath is back here. There's a chain here that you're not supposed to go here. See the chain? Don't ask me how I got here. And these are all outcrops of Potomac Marble, and you can see it close up, okay? These are huge outcrops, by the way. really interesting. They like bubble out of the surface. It's amazing. Okay. Now, as a result of having Potomac Marble, we have in Loudoun County something called the Limestone Overlay District. And the reason is this Potomac Marble, because it's limestone, is soluble. And you can't build in my county, in this area, unless you x-ray the soil first to make sure that there are no sinkholes, known by geologists as karsts, K-A-R-S-T-S. Because if you're not allowed to build, you have to make sure that there are no sinkholes, because it's very soluble. You probably can't see it, but every black dot here is a sinkhole in Loudoun County. All right. And what I find somewhat humorous is in Leesburg, just 2 years ago, we were building a garage, and right where they were building this huge garage, they found these 2 sinkholes, and we had to spend $3.5 million of our tax money to fix the sinkholes before we could finish the garage. Why they didn't x-ray it or what happened, I don't know. Okay. The other thing we have is caverns. Because it's so soluble, we have caverns underground. This is a area my daughter went to daycare. This was her daycare center. Now it's a school for children with disabilities. It's called Carhigh Manor, Paxton. And under it is a lake. And I contacted the president of the school and I said, would you mind if I took pictures? Because I happen to know where the entrance to the cavern is. And she said, sure. She was very nice about it. And there's the entrance. Unfortunately, they put a big concrete stopper on it, so you can't go in anymore. There's another entrance, you'll find this amusing, which is here. Oh, ignore the skeletons. They use this mansion in Halloween as a big Shocktober thing to raise funds. And I was taking these pictures around Shocktober. But actually, this is an entrance to a large cavern right under Leesburg, as a matter of fact. Okay, final question. Where exactly were the Potomac Marble quarries located? Now we get into a real question. Do you guys in Montgomery County have the honor of saying that we were the people who provided the columns for the Capitol, those beautiful columns, or was it those Loudoun County people across the river in Leesburg who provided it? And I was determined I was going to find out where the hole in the ground was that provided those quarries. And unfortunately, Benjamin Latrobe did a terrible thing. He wrote over and over again, the quarries are situated in Loudoun County, Virginia, and Montgomery County, Maryland. Okay, that's what he says over and over again. Okay, well, that's a problem. That's a big area. But if you begin looking more closely at it, you'll find a letter he wrote on August 8th, 1815, where he says, the largest mass of this kind of rock, Potomac Marble, is situated on the Maryland side of the Potomac, on land the property of Samuel Clapham. It overhangs the river and would furnish without any land carriage all the columns of the Capitol of 1 block each if required, and of beauty not exceeded in any modern or ancient building. And sure enough, if you look into federal contracts and stuff in 1816, the federal government contracted with this Mr. Clapham, who, by the way, is a big mover and shaker in Loudoun County, and he contracted for 22 Corinthian Columns. Well, this is really getting us close, isn't it? Because he's telling us it's on this huge outcrop overlooking the Potomac River on the land of Samuel Clapham. What else do we know? Well, then a friend of mine found this advertisement in a Leesburg newspaper. Dated, this is the name of the news. They had great names for newspapers in those days. Genius of Liberty, that was the name of the newspaper. August 8th, 1817. Wanted immediately at the Marble Quarry, Montgomery County, Maryland, on the Potomac, 100 strong and healthy laboring men to whom liberal wages will be given, and for strong and healthy Negro men, $90 from the 1st of April until the 1st of January next, or in proportion for such time as they shall remain at the quarry, by order of the President of the United States. And then this list of people, when you research them, you find out they're every mover and shaker in Frederick County, Montgomery County, and in Loudoun County. Okay, well, now we're pointing to the fact that there's an active quarry and we're getting to where it is. Okay, then you can find Latrobe's sketchbook. And this is his sketch. And look what he says. It's opposite Clapham Island. Now, Clapham Island is called Mason Island. I don't know how many of you are fishermen like me, but if you're fishermen, we know Mason Island. Always fish off Mason Island. Okay. Well, we're getting closer. Then I got lucky. I had a email relationship with Mary Orland, who's the historical preservation officer at the Capitol. And one fine day, she emails me a Xerox PDF of a memorandum from January 1965. All right. And before I talk about this memorandum, let me say this. There are a lot of historians who've walked the area from Clapham Island, from White's Ferry up, looking for the quarries and never found them. Okay, I've spoken to them. All right. This memorandum was written because in 1965, they had to repair the Senate columns. They were looking for the actual quarry, like I was. All right. And they sent out Owen Ramsberg, who was an engineer, and other people. And they began this whole tour of Loudoun County and Montgomery County, just like what Monroe did, just like what Latrobe did, the same tour, looking for the quarry. And they went up to Point of Rocks, and they thought, well, that might be good, but they said, that's not it. They looked in Loudoun County. They said, that doesn't match. And they looked up and down between White's Ferry and Point of Rocks. Finally, they gave up and they contacted the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, I think it's called. And they said, here's our problem. And the Department of Natural Resources, forgive me if I got the name wrong, we'll call it that for now, mobilized an expedition, and they sent out officers exploring. And in Christmas of 1964, they found the quarry, okay? It had been lost since, like 1820. They found it. And they write in this paper that the quarry is 2.8 miles up from White's Ferry. All right. And I said, wow, I just go to White's Ferry. I walk up 2.8 miles. I'll see it, right? Okay. Let's take a look at that. Whoops. Okay. Let's orient. Here's White's Ferry, right? Here's the Potomac River. Okay. Here's Mason Island. All right. Here's the Cno Canal. Now look, the Cno Canal wasn't built. It was built starting in the 1820s, right? It has nothing to do with this story. So, because there was no Cno Canal. What we had here, I'm using the Cno Canal to walk on the towpan. And I walked exactly 2.8 miles. I had a little device on my phone, right, which would tell me how far I was walking. And let me catch up because I don't want to get the numbers wrong. I'm getting there. There we are. Okay. And I turn to the right because I'm on the towpath, right? I turn to the right and I look up, and by now the leaves had fallen from the trees. And there I saw a quarry. That was the quarry. I saw the quarry too. And then, and this is a big joke, I had this device to find 2.8 miles. When I look to my left, there's a big canal marker which says, milepost 38. So if I'd known that, it would have been a lot easier. So anyway, so there's the quarry. And whoops, there's a picture of me in the quarry. This is all Potomac Marble. There's red sandstone, there's bluestone. Here's Potomac Marble again. Here is a column that failed. And John Walsh, who's a historian from Poolesville, and I lead expeditions here. And if you join one of our expeditions, we'll take you up to this quarry and we'll show you how this worked. So this is the quarry. Now, before I go any further, there's a lot more proof than this. John and I in the National Archive have gone through the surveyor's books, so the surveyors for the Cno Canal. And in the surveyor's books, they have maps noting Latrobe's quarry, and it's right here. Okay, so there's and these things were done in the 1823, 1824. They're almost contemporary. So let's keep going. What about Leesburg, Virginia? Does my hometown have any right to say it had anything to do with this? Well, here's where the problem of historians and history appears. We have a local historian here in Loudoun who's a wonderful historian and a great map maker, wonderful guy. And he quotes a 19th century, his name is Eugene Shield, and he quotes a 19th century cartographer, Yardley Taylor. He made the first comprehensive map of Loudoun County. And what Yardley Taylor says, here's the book, the rock, he says this, Potomac Marble in Loudoun County, and the rock was used for the pillars in the columns at the Capitol, okay? That's what he says. He doesn't say what quarry, where it was, so that's useless, all right? All right, then I went to the Geology of Virginia during the Triassic, and he just repeats what Latrobe says. The stone was taken from quarries located in Loudoun County, Virginia, and in Montgomery County, Maryland, all right? In fact, if you go through history between, say, 1850 and today, you will see that phrase repeated constantly. No one says where it is. Okay, now, what one of our local historians said is that that in Leesburg, we have a quarry, which is now called Old Isaac Walton Park, and that this pond is a quarry, and that's where the Potomac Marble came from. So, being the skeptic that I am, I took a little device that you attach to a fishing rod, you cast it out over the water, and as you draw it in, it shows on your phone how deep the water is. And nowhere is this more than 7 feet deep. So this is not a quarry. But lo and behold, if you walk 150 feet south of that, there's a quarry. Now, was this a quarry where the Potomac Marble columns came from? I don't know. I see no proof of it at all. If you take a piece of the stone here, or here, isn't that a lovely picture a friend of mine took? This is the Potomac Marble in the Old Isaac Walton Park. And if you polish it, it looks like this. It's beautiful. It's certainly the quality that could be the columns, but there's nothing in history that I found that points to the fact that it is, okay? So that one's out. And the other quarry that's been pointed to is in Leesburg again. It's Leesburg Limestone Quarry. It operated to the early 20th century. It was a deep quarry. Now it's a parking lot. It's what it looks like now. But we were fortunate that when we went around the parking lot, some animals had dug down into the dirt and it kicked out some samples of the Potomac Marble. And when I polished it, you can see it looks very different. It doesn't really have all those red colors and dark colors. So I don't think this could be the columns either. So where did the Potomac Marble columns come from? Along the Potomac in Montgomery County? Yes. In Leesburg, for example, Old Isaac Walton Park. I don't know, can't prove it, would love to prove it. Somewhere else in Loudoun County, love to prove it. I think, see, my theory is, of course, these guys went and looked at all these Potomac Marble quarries. There were lots of quarries. That's how they made limestone. But that doesn't mean the contract came from any of these quarries. And we know the contract came from the one in Montgomery County. All right, here's a summary as we draw to the end. As far as I can determine, Potomac Marble was only used once in a significant project, and that was 1817 through 1819 in the Capitol, in the two rooms that I showed you, the old House chamber and the old Senate chamber. It was very difficult to work with. Single columns could not be quarried. 26 feet long columns had to be broken up into 3 parts. In fact, just smoothing it out with chisels, they had to have one guy holding a chisel and 2 guys with the hammers. It was so hard to work with. As a result, the Hall of Representatives was not completed until 1819. Each column didn't cost $1,500, but $5,000. But here's what's important. Latrobe's vision of a magnificent neoclassical hall formed with a towering, richly colored colonnade had been realized. And most important, the British attempt to demoralize and dissolve the United States failed. From this, in 1814, we had this in 1822. Okay, once again, here's the old House of Representatives, now the statuary with its Corinthian columns. Here's the old Senate chamber with its, now I'm having a mind lapse. And here's a close-up of the columns. You see the seam in the column because you couldn't make them 26 feet long. You see this thing here? That's a piece of black wax. When some of these clasps fall out, they fill it in with black wax. See this here? Here is at Camp Conowa, somebody carved a Potomac Marble obelisk. And I got to go back someday and see if the obelisk is still there. For all I know, it's jumping around the world, making a magic appearance. Has nothing on it, doesn't say anything on it. It's just a Potomac Marble obelisk. Here are two things some of my friends carved. My friend carved an orb out of Potomac marble, and he carved a little jewelry box, which is gorgeous, as you can see. To read more about the search for Latrobe's quarry, you can read my article, which is on www.cnocanal.org, Potomac Marble. That's my email address, and I'm done. Are there any questions?
So the first question that we have in the chat is, what propelled a 300-pound concrete rocket?
Oh, black powder. They use black powder. That's all they had was black powder, which they still use today when you shoot muskets. And what the chemical composition of black powder is, I don't know. But of course, the Chinese invented that. All right.
Our next question in the chat is, were the glass panes part of the rebuilt Capitol ceiling?
No, Latrobe was against that glass. And no, not at all. In fact, wait, I'll show you the ceiling. Hold on. Good question. Because it's sometimes, for me, it's not confusing, right? Because I've seen this 100 times. Here's the ceiling. Okay. There's no glass panels. The glass panels were really problematic. I mean, you have to understand now, this is 1803 through 1817. What are the materials that people use in those days? Think about it. We have wood, we have stone, we have ceramic, like from clay, right? And we have from plants, like fabrics, like cotton from plants, right, or hemp, right? That's what they had. Compare, there was a revolution that occurred before, during, and after the Civil War, where a plethora of products were developed for every industrial, architectural, for home life. None of this existed here. There were no machines. Everything was done by hand, pretty much. They had steam engines, but their applications were limited. Pumping water out of coal mines, pumping water into reservoirs. So the idea of having a ceiling with 100 openings with a piece of glass was a nightmare for Latrobe. And it was a nightmare. I mean, it had problems. It leaked and all kinds of things. So that's why it wasn't. Good idea, though. We could do it nowadays. Obviously, we could have a whole glass dome. That's no problem for us.
If we have any further questions, feel free to unmute and ask them. I see one more. How did the polishing take place? How long and how many people to do this?
Oh, well, that's a great question because I just found out. They polished it using, I'm sorry, what's on a nail file? What's the stuff on a nail file? It's called the material on a nail file. Anyway, I forgot.
Emery board?
Thank you. Emery. They used emery and sand. They had wool cloths, and they would put the sand or the emery on the stone, and they would rub. Now, how many people? They had 100 people at the quarry, which was a big problem because there was nothing there. I mean, they had to build houses for them. They had to bring food out to them, etc. The only advantage they had is that quarry is overlooked. Oh, I didn't say this, and I should. When John and I take people to the quarry, they're often disappointed because they expect to be going into this big, deep hole in the ground. But this is a quarry in the air. The key thing about this quarry is it's a huge stone outcrop overlooking the Potomac River, which meant you could put boats in the Potomac River and you could chop out the rock and put it right on boats and take it right down the Potomac River to Washington. Does that statement make any sense to you? You ever been on the Potomac River? Like now? You think you could take a boat loaded with thousands of pounds of stone down the Potomac River?
Yeah.
Well, that's a big problem. So what they had to rely on was the fact that Washington had determined that he wanted to make the Potomac River navigable. So he set up the Potomac River Company. And the Potomac River Company did not build a canal, okay? What the Potomac River Company did, starting in the 1790s, because we didn't have anyone who knew how to build locks for a canal in the 70s. We had no one who could do it in this country. They sent squads of men up the Potomac and every tributary, up the Shenandoah, up the Monocacy, and they, quote, this is the quote, they got rid of the rocks. In other words, wherever there was rapids or wherever there was a problem, they would blow it up with black powder and create sluices. So that, in other words, you're going down the Potomac, and where there had been let's say ripples, on the right side, there would be a buoy that would indicate if you stayed to the right, there'd be a sluice. Okay, even with that, the Potomac was only navigable 50 days a year because they had to wait for the rain. They could only go on the Potomac when it rained. Now, you guys live near the Potomac, you know what I mean, right? The Potomac, when it rains, can become a roaring river, and that's when they went on it. When you and I avoided is when they went on it. They had boats that were 70 feet long and 9 feet wide. They had 4 men on it, 2 on the side, 1 in the front, 1 in the back to steer it. And they would go, and there was a whole culture built around these boats, which would moor together in various towns, waiting for the spring freshets. And they would load the boats up with wheat and with coal and with Potomac marble, and they'd wait for the freshets, which is the word they use for rain. It's a great word. We should use it again. And when the rain came, they would release the boats and go roaring down the Potomac River. And then what happened? They got to Great Falls. Well, by the time Potomac Canal, the time this quarry was being worked, they had finally built a canal around Great Falls, and you can go see the remains of that now. And then a canal around Little Falls. Before that, they had basically a chute like this, and they would unload, let's say, the wheat, which was the barrels. They'd unload it from their boats, they'd roll it down the chute, and they'd pick it up below. But by then, you had, the canal was built in 2 places, Little Falls and Great Falls. So if you were brave enough to take a 70-foot boat loaded with tons and tons of stone or wheat or coal down a rushing river, you could get to Georgetown pretty quick, which was the great seaport. Washington had hoped to make Washington a seaport. And then on the way back, they just dragged the boats back up. There were capstans, they could throw ropes around, and there were iron bars on the side, and they would pull the boats back up. So I don't know how I got onto the boats, but I'm glad I did, because that's a pretty interesting story. But that's the thing about this quarry. It was on the river, so they could get this stuff down to Washington. And that's why Acai Creek was so important earlier, because it was on the river. I hope I answered the question. Any more questions?
Feel free to send any further questions in the chat or unmute and ask them directly. I know we got a couple more that I think you answered.
Well, what are they? Maybe I can riff on them.
Are you going to have any more walks to the quarry?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I broke my ankle, so I'm not going to be walking the quarry. I mean, I know John has been leading a few. We'll definitely have walks in the fall, in the autumn. It's an expedition. We start at the power plant. We walk 2 miles. It's about 2 miles. It's shorter from the power plant than from White's Ferry. We walk about 2 miles, and then John talks about Civil War history, which he knows a lot about. There's a lot of Civil War history on those 2 miles. And then we go up into the quarry and talk all about the quarry itself. Yes, we will do it again. You may see, let me put in the chat, actually. Let me put in the chat. Let me stop sharing, if I can figure it out how. And let me put in the chat my email address. There we go. There it is. I'm going to put in the chat. Have I stopped sharing? Yes.
Yes.
My email address. And if anybody wants to get in touch with me, they can. And I will put you on a list the next time we do I want to send this to everyone. The next time we do it, we call it the expeditions, because that's kind of a cool name, isn't it? Here's my email. And if you think you know anyone who would want this lecture, be happy to do it. I love doing this, as you can tell. I'm very enthusiastic about it. So there's my email address. Okay. Are there any more questions? Oh, did they blast the sluice at Great Falls or affect the portage? Yes, they did the canal. Hey, it's really worth going to Great Falls. They've got some good documentation there, and you can see how they did it.
Any last questions? Well, of course, Paul put his email in the chat, and you can also email info@poolsvilleseniors.org if you have later questions you'd like us to pass along. I hope you all enjoyed tonight's presentation as much as I did and learned something new. If you think of any questions, pass them along to us or send them to Paul. If you'd like to unmute and turn your camera on to say goodbye, now would be the time. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, please leave a like and comment. I'd like to thank Paul so much for this presentation, as well as our ongoing sponsors and private contributors that help us keep our programs going, because we love putting them on for you. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, please consider joining us for more upcoming events. We'll be back Wednesday at 2 p.m. with Amelia Earhart, Dreams Take Flight. So if you'd like to meet Amelia Earhart, register on our website, poolsvilleseniors.org, and join us for that. I hope you all have a nice evening. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, thank you so much. It was so good to see you again. I hope your ankle heals nicely. Because that is a hike up the hill. It almost killed me, but I made it. I made it to the quarry.
Yeah, it always kills me every time too. Only John is so unfit.
I know. Yeah. Yeah. It's the long legs. I'm just.
Oh, there he is. There's John right over here. John, are you planning an expedition soon?
No, I'm not. I did one on Monday, but I don't have any planned currently.
Okay. Well, we'll do it, and we'll let you know. Actually, when we do it, we'll just tell you, Tookie.
Yeah. There you go. I'll be there. Yep.
You can
And I'll get the Poolsville seniors to come out for you.
Yeah, exactly. That's how we'll do it. Okay. So that way everyone will find out about it.
Absolutely. Yep. That's great. Thank you so much. It's great to see you.